living and working in New York City. Um, he works in a wide range of private gardens across the Bronx, Manhattan, and Brooklyn. Previously, Philip has worked in a number of public gardens, including Smithsonian Gardens, where he managed the landscape here at the Museum of Natural History. Uh, NYC Parks and Recreation, where he was the head gardener of City Hall Park. And also New York Botanical Garden, where he worked in the William and Lynda Steere Herbarium. Philip has a degree in plant science from the University of Maryland, College Park. And I'll pass it over to
Thank you,
you.
Carl.
How do we get
Believe that we've also living here.
Thanks for being here, though.
Oh, thanks for coming, Phil. Oh, look, it's Alice.
And I've got over here, share this PowerPoint.
Yeah, it's great.
No, not that one.
You to share?
Go back and hit set up slideshow.
Yeah.
Oh, all right. Set up slideshow. Share slideshow. Where is setup slideshow?
Well, the easiest thing is the one down on the bottom, but you can't
all
seem
right.
to see it.
This
Yeah, that right. That one.
right.
Why is
Never-
that not going to the?
If you click
Slideshow.
swap displays, it will work.
Oh, all right.
Holly.
Oh, maybe that's the problem.
Swap
Hey.
displays.
There you go.
There you go.
Perfect.
All right. Well, thank you very much for the technical assistance.
Yeah.
Is everyone able to see the slide?
Yeah, great.
All right. Take it away.
Wonderful. Okay. Hi, everyone. I will get used to looking at the screen and the people in the room and knowing that there are people out virtually. And I just want to first thank everyone for taking your Tuesday evening to be here as a society of interested people in botany, horticulture. As tonight, I will be presenting sort of my career in both botany and horticulture, kind of all over the place. I have had the privilege of working in DC and New York, like Carl introduced myself as, and also a lot of this story is out of the city. So I kind of tweaked the title of the presentation from what you might have been emailed. But this is tonight going to be a story of botany and horticulture in and out of the American city, which has kind of given me the context for the work that I've done over the last decade as an emerging horticulturist in my field. So a little bit briefly about me. I am from Myersville, Maryland, which is a pretty rural part of Frederick County. I did graduate from the University of Maryland, degree in plant science. I was very focused at that time in plant propagation and crop production. So it was more of like a farm influence in my college years. But since then, I am a professional ornamental horticulturist. I enjoy botany as an amateur, naturalism. I'm an avid forager, skier, biker, and I am currently living between Brooklyn and Frederick, sort of in and off of my seasons. I did include this picture of me on the left. That's me swinging from a massive grapevine on our parents' property out in rural Frederick, and it kind of sets the scene for how plants have always been a integral part of my landscape. And to first talk about that landscape, this is a typical scene of where I grew up. This is the woodlands on the right of the property I grew up on, and this field used to be a farm field. So what you're seeing is sort of like a 50-year-old succession of a lot of ash trees, a few oaks, some black walnuts. and a proliferation of Rubus funiculaceus, which I'm sure you guys know is our invasive wineberry. But I include this here because this was my first sort of awareness of plants as taking up space because as a kid, I could not wait till late July to go pick these wineberries and make milkshakes with my friends. It was just like absolutely essential that we pick the wineberries. And it's been very fascinating as I've learned more about ecology and native plants that the wineberries are now the very thing that I am ripping out everywhere I go. But from a young age, these plants were very important to me. I did want to highlight just the movement of invasive plants. Our first record that I could find of wineberries in Maryland was from 1917. That red dot kind of around Silver Spring was where it was geolocated. And thanks to the National Herbarium, we can know that information. And so these are just some vignettes of like what I grew up around. And at the time, I didn't have any names for these plants. Now we know that that's a bloodroot next to a thalictrum, next to, Dutchman's breeches and clatonias and erythroniums. But also, if you look at the picture on the right-hand side, that erythronium, as beautiful as it is being smothered by garlic mustard. And so growing up in Western Maryland, I was just surrounded by these beautiful vignettes of Uvularia petiolata, Actea racemosa, Nablus altissima, all of these just like seasonal plants throughout the woodland that I didn't identify. I didn't even know names for them, but they were just kind of around me. And so this question of like, wow, did I live in a pristine environment out in Western Maryland? Unfortunately not. The emerald ash borer has been a destructive pest to really the entire East Coast, moving west. And almost every mature ash tree in the property that I grew up on has since died due to this invasive pest. But to that degree, I have spent in sort of my off seasons and returning back to Maryland over the span of the last decade. I spend a lot of time removing invasive bittersweet. And the ash trees here in the middle, that's an ash tree covered with bittersweet. That even just this winter alone, I've been desperately removing all of that bittersweet and watching as our ash trees are actually rejuvenating from the soil seed bank. And including removal of wineberries, the more that I remove wineberries and invasive honeysuckles, we're getting a return of our Thalictrum thalictroides, our early meadow ruse, to just see these ephemerals really bouncing back as soon as I am taking the initiative to remove these invasive species. So that was sort of a case study of where I'm from, and I'm now going to really jump through some of the garden experiences that have sort of shaped my career. So as I mentioned earlier, I did graduate from the University of Maryland. I took my traditional lab botany, kind of started to finally learn the names of all these plants that I grew up by using the Flora of Virginia, which I'm sure many people in this room are familiar with. It's a great resource to just like learn all of your natives, also get like a good baseline of your invasives. This is Wisteria sinensis, which covers half of Maryland, I'm pretty sure. And at my time at University of Maryland, I was also, like I mentioned, deep into sort of like farming propagation. So I managed a small farm in Columbia Heights called Columbia Heights Green. It's right behind El Chucho, if people in the district are familiar with that. And just had a great experience, both working this quarter-acre farm and kind of engaging the community, having events, and it being a public forum space, which has always been sort of a cornerstone of my work. As I was finishing up at the University of Maryland, Dr. Miley Neal, she is the director of the Norton Brown Herbarium. It was sort of my first experience learning what herbaria are and why they're important. They're not obviously just dried plants with nothing to say. She taught taxonomy to me through a very phylogenetic perspective, which has really framed a lot of the ecologic work, like based on like a botanic background, which has been very important to me as I got more into gardening and less so botany. It was great to have that foundation. And here on the right side, Miley had developed an app to learn plant identification. And back in 2018, I was confusing, obviously, rhododendron paraclimanoides with the Cornacea, which is an egregious mistake, but I have learned since then, don't worry. This is just a zoom in of that label east of Riverdale, right next to campus. And this is me in my lab final right before I graduated, identifying what looks to be Acer Negundo, perhaps. And so I graduated from the University of Maryland and moved to Hawaii, of all places. I was working on a horticultural therapy farm. So I'm not going to talk really about that experience, just out of privacy for our clientele. But I was really fascinated by the flora of Hawaii. And from these three plants that I have put up, I saw them absolutely everywhere, but they were not native plants. And so what I did was I turned to the library and found my local flora, and I started desperately looking for native plants in Hawaii, but all of these, as beautiful as they are not native to Hawaii. So I started to realize that invasion ecology is not just a problem in Maryland, but probably much worse in Hawaii. And I was really desperate to find a native plant in Hawaii, coconuts not being native to Hawaii either. But of course, I was in Hawaii and I had not yet climbed up the volcanoes, so I thought maybe I'll find some native plants there. And to my success and joy, I finally found the tree of Hawaii, the state tree of Hawaii, the Ohia lehua, Metrosideros polymorpha, which is this stunning plant that grows from the lava flows on these volcanic ridges. And on this volcanic hike, I got to meet Acacia goa, which is an endemic plant used to make canoes. Coprosma ernodioides, I think I might say that right, is an important food source for the endangered nene bird, as well as the fruits being used for lei making. Dubaudia ciliolata is an asteraceous native endemic to Hawaii, and Leptocophila Kamehameha, which that specific epithet is actually in reference to King Kamehameha, who settled the Hawaiian Islands, or not settled, yes, unified, excuse me. We have the fact checker here. But it was wonderful to see, yes. It was wonderful to actually meet these endemic plants, which 80% of the flora in Hawaii is endemic to these islands. So to be inundated by all these non-natives, as beautiful as they are, it really spoke to a deeper connection to the land when I got to meet these plants. And they're a lot less showy for the most part. So I spent a few months in Hawaii and decided to island hop to New York City because why not? I had an opportunity to start working as an intern in the William and Lynda Steere Herbarium, in this beautiful library building here with its Italian Renaissance architecture. If y'all haven't been, please go visit. And I was digitizing herbarium specimens. I had had a little bit of work, like I mentioned, at the Norton Brown Herbarium, but this was really full-time digitization work. I sat in front of this photo light box and would try to get through at least 1,000 specimens a day. And we would wear sunglasses in this dark room because the light boxes were so intense. But it was just such a privilege to get up close and personal to thousands upon thousands of specimens and really learn just the beautiful language of the herbaria, including all of these like really sweet notes from 1905, like just how people communicated to each other as botanists, in the time before emails and the internet. I love this example of this ribes. I kind of zoomed in on this letter that came from the specimen. Just again, this is pre sort of internet communication, and a lot of how people talk to each other was just through like sending specimens. And I mean, I'm from the millennial era. Like it's just really sweet to see how ideas were expressed at this very like intimate specimen level. Of course, I came across Solastris orbicularis, the demon bittersweet that I had been battling my entire life. And all of the interns got assigned their families, their plant families that they digitized. And it was, of course, sought after to get the Cannabaceae. And I did get to digitize the Cannabaceae, but don't worry, this is humulus, so it's safe for our viewers. I also got to work on the alliums, and there are so many more species of alliums than I could have ever dreamed. I was working on the alliums for what felt like probably 4 weeks. This was my onion cart, as I like to call it. And if I could get through like half of that in a day, I'd be happy. Here was I pulled this specimen out for reference because of this really tender note that I'll zoom in. It was a dull day, in quotes, and as I came over a rise, I saw far ahead of me a bush with a number of strange birds poking their heads above it. These were the birds, and it was some garlic inflorescence. So just these really sweet ways of how people communicate through specimens. There's really some gems to be found. Part of my internship was also pulling out interesting specimens to tell stories so that the average person who's not into botany or knows the first thing about it can kind of have an in to herbaria. When you tell people you're digitizing dead plants all day long, they really don't understand why it's important. So these were some of the articles that I wrote of a few interesting specimens, which I really thought this atomic specimen was fascinating. Um, I will click ahead to the specimen. And if you look at the label closely, this plant, which is a what is it called? Thumbleweed. No, not tumbleweed. Tumbleweed. This is a tumbleweed species that was found 4 years after the first atomic bomb site explosion. And I just thought it was interesting, to be botanizing in that site, and that the plant itself kind of looks like a mushroom cloud. So just trying to find ways to have interesting stories to tell within all of these plants. And when I was not digitizing, I was taking my lunch breaks in the beautiful gardens, enjoying the sights of spring at the New York Botanic Garden. Into summer, there was a gorgeous Roberto Burle Marx exhibit that I fell in love with, and just the gardens in general were so inspiring. And I was starting to kind of get an outside itch to be back in the gardens, but lunch would end and I'd be back into the alleys of the herbarium, which everyone that's attending in person got to walk through the National Herbarium hallways. It's very similar at New York. Um, but in sort of that effort to keep getting outside through this internship, I connected with Dr. James Lendemer and Dr. Laura Bogus, who are lichenologists or at least at the time in 2019, were lichenologists at the garden, and went on a lichen collection trip in the Great Smoky Mountains with them. And that weekend, I helped them look at all of these lichens that I could not tell you the names of because that's not my specialty. But I learned how to collect them, and then they did a lot of determining of species. And there's just so much incredible lichen diversity, all kinds of diversity in the Smoky Mountains. So this was just a privilege to kind of follow the footsteps of botanists. And it was a lot of this, looking at interesting rocks and them arguing over the minutia of what something was. And I'd just be like, yeah, okay, cool. I did get to determine a species of my own, looking at the microscope and observing these lips on this Graphius stricta, which is a pretty easily identifiable species, but did learn how to identify lichens using thin layer chromatography. And again, I was more so just like watching this process with the acids, and this was our setup using a pancake griddle, which you need some heat to. Don't ask me, I'm not an expert in this, but it was just really, it was a privilege to be along with these lichenologists and learning some of their process. For example, when we couldn't take a bark graft of a piece of lichen that we were collecting, this was their method for photographing a piece of lichen on a rock that we're obviously not going to take back to the lab because it's too big, and just different ways to manipulate what we have to do for science. And so I finally got back to New York, and let's see if this video plays. No? Let me play it. That's okay. It's a video of a gorgeous stand of Geranium maculatum. Oh, now my slide isn't moving forward. Oh, I see. Gorgeous, huge stand of Geranium maculatum in nowhere but Inwood Hill Park in the northern tip of Manhattan. So I was really starting to get this itch for finding wild spaces living in New York this summer. Inwood being a gorgeous old growth forest that still remains in Manhattan. And if you have never been, Fort Tryon Park is there. The Met Cloisters is in this area. And there are a million gems to discover up in this area, and you forget that you are in Manhattan. I also made my way out to Flushing Meadow, Queens to find some Hibiscus moschutos and Asclepias incarnata with some monarchs enjoying those milkweeds, and just for a reference of like where in the massive city of New York this is. Out to Jamaica Bay Wildlife Refuge, also in Queens, for our native Apuntia humifusa and our native poison ivy. These are plant communities that exist, and you can't demonize a poison ivy, can you? I'm very allergic though. And Baptisia, and just it's amazing to like have found a lot of these wild places in New York that like not all is lost, not all is paved over in a skyscraper, that these very much exist on the fringes of the city. This was a really cool area if you haven't been to Jamaica Bay, all these islands, ecosystems. And I lived in Park Slope, so I was really close to Prospect Park. And in the heart of the park, I found this patch of Trillium. And if you kind of look around the base of that Trillium, that is goutweed, which is an aggressive invasive plant that I have a picture for later. But Trillium is not common in Prospect Park, and this was not cultivated. Same with these May apples in the heart of the park and these bluebells. Finding these plants, it was incredibly rare. Like you don't just like run into these specimens everywhere you go in Prospect Park. In fact, you will probably just run into goutweed. And so my internship had ended, and I was lucky enough to get a job for New York Parks and Rec as a gardener. We were kind of stationed on Randall's Island, and we had like a kind of ragtag nursery operation, but we got it done. And I was on the mobile crew for my first couple of months, which basically meant we would go to playgrounds and green streets and medians everywhere in Manhattan. And on the right, I'm removing a giant elm root that was kind of clogging up a bedding area that we couldn't get any annuals in. So we spent a whole day digging out that massive root of the elm. And I'm sure people in the National Mall know about our elms, but they are incredibly weedy and super annoying to deal with. Um, and we had our fall annual changeouts in all of these small little parks, and just got to really learn about the city through a horticultural angle. These couple months in my new job, I got to learn how to prune roses for the first time, because this was my first time being a gardener, putting my degree finally to use in an ornamental way outside of a farm system. And luckily enough, the Manhattan Mobile Gardening Crew got to put on the haunted house at Gracie Mansion for the mayor. I am the zombie who appears to be dead on the grounds there. I scared many children. But just some context of how difficult it is to keep a garden alive in a place like New York City. So many of these gardens do not have irrigation systems. So on the right-hand side is our watering truck, which is trying to water those mums that we just installed. And this is the base of the Brooklyn Bridge landing. So this is where thousands upon thousands of tourists are coming in and out all day, every day. And you don't see any people in there because we were dramatically keeping everyone off so that we could water for at least 10 minutes. Our crew was also responsible for resodding the baseball fields up in Morningside Park. We really did it all. We would plant over, this is Sutton Place with the Queensboro Bridge in the background. There was no limit to where we went. I did want to kind of talk about a case study that was really sort of a first jarring moment for me in public service. This is Harlem Art Park, obviously in Harlem in Manhattan, with this really beautiful sculpture in the middle called Growth by Jorge Luis Rodriguez. And then this planted area full of oak leaf hydrangeas and skip laurels, which were really big to kind of appreciate the scale. They were about 5 to 6 feet tall. But unfortunately, in this park, community members were complaining and reporting that people were sleeping in these shrubs. And unfortunately like using drugs and just not being very safe to all community people. So we were tasked as the gardeners to come and remove all of these plantings. And this was, again, like I was saying, like my first time just really struggling with being told to do something that you like really don't agree with and don't even think is a solution to a deeper problem, but you don't have sort of like the capacity as just a gardener to, go up the chain and make a big fuss about it. So you found myself, removing these shrubs. And while I was doing so, wildly found a plant, or I found an Asarum aerifolium, excuse me, which don't know if that plant was, cultivated in this garden area. It was the only one, so it didn't lead me to believe that it had been or how it got there. But even just some iNaturalist investigations, it had never been reported in anywhere near New York City. So just a very interesting kind of uh, difference of these plant removals, finding like this species that you're not really even sure, and having this slice of ecological kind of awareness. And well, it all has to be turfed over anyway. So disappointing. And it really sat with me for a while, this experience. Responsible horticulture, I don't know, that can be debated. I did want to quickly go back to botany. Why are we at Rockefeller Center? Does anyone in the room know? Huh? Skating, you can skate there. Well, these ladders were really conveniently placed. Let's try to zoom in. What is that plaque saying? Those are also really bad angles. So I bring up the Rockefeller Center because the Elgin Botanic Garden actually existed on the site of where current day Rockefeller Center is. And it was our first medical and public botanic garden in America. So going back to these ladders in front of this plaque, this is the only remnants sort of recognition if you go visit Rockefeller Center of this history. But very fascinating that we have kind of lost this touchstone of history in such a immensely visited area in the heart of Manhattan. This is Hortus elginensis. This is sort of like an herbarium catalog of the plants that were growing in that greenhouse. And a zoom in of that label, someone at some point was like, is this the Manhattan one? Like, people have definitely forgotten about this history. But this was just part of my explorations while living up in the city at that time. And so I was still a gardener for the city. And at this point, we were approaching the holidays. They needed me to all of a sudden become the head gardener of City Hall. The last gardener had been absent for a while and had actually moved to a different park. So they asked me if I wanted to be their gardener, and I said, sure. This was us prepping for the winter displays, using a lot of potted annuals and evergreens, or not annuals, these are all mostly evergreens. And I got right to work planting the parterre and doing my first bulb layout, which I had never done before. And what I really appreciated about saying yes to this role and removing myself from the mobile crew was that like it was now my time to like learn how to be a gardener. And there's really no better way than to just go out and do it. So that's what I was up to. I was learning how to successfully plant rows of tulips. And when council members within City Hall needed me to repot their office plants, I was in the basement of City Hall doing that for them. Learning just like the flora of the park. That's a larch on the left-hand side. I had never heard of a hellebores before and was shocked that it was blooming on January 2nd. Also, I just was familiarizing myself with a lot of ornamental plants that I hadn't come into contact with, like this Amsonia. And it was winter, so all I had was these weird fruit follicles. And I got to botanize still and figure out what things were that I had never met. Seeing a puncha, humifusa, like, is it dead? What do I do with that? And learning that it's a native and that it should, just be chilling for the winter. Some witch hazel, learning which ferns like Dryopteris marginalis are winter hardy and still beautiful. And our Pyrrhus japonica, which started blooming in March, along with Cornus mas, and learning which ferns are also beautiful in winter, even though they're not green, like this ostrich fern. And then March 2020, I will see if this video works. because it does set a scene. Nope, that's okay. It to paint you a picture, which I'm sure is not hard to fathom, but it was a panorama video of the park with nobody in it, not a soul. And yeah, the pandemic happened in March 2020, and gardeners for Parks and Rec were essential workers. So I was still camped out in City Hall Park, and it was a beautiful spring, I have to say. The saucer magnolias in this park are to die for. Um, and it was just like a deeply reflective time to, be in this new role, to be in charge of this park, and everything is shut down around you. But um, here I was. There was this clipping that I came across from 1970 of someone in a mask smelling a saucer magnolia petal from City Hall, which was just kind of an eerie, ominous, you know, time to come. I got to enjoy all of the tulips that I planted and definitely take note of nobody in the background of these pictures. It was a very interesting time to be a new gardener. Um, and then just to kind of back up and give some context of City Hall was sort of like the commons of New York City for its history. It was a place where people came together to demonstrate, and by the time the summer rolled around, people were still using City Hall as a commons to demonstrate and use their voice at the seat of city government to tell the mayor, to tell their council members how they were feeling about the situations that they were facing. So all of those trees that you see, those are in City Hall Park territory. Those were under my facilitation, and people were demonstrating on the plaza, and people were deciding to do some gardening of their own. And I was really coming to terms with how do I, in this civic role as a gardener, use a lot of this force of this interest to like participate and to be a part of like a public space, which is this not like the commons of the city as it's been historically called. And so I used this energy to basically create City Hall Park Alliance. City Hall is an 8-acre park, and it was a lot for just myself to maintain and weed and plant and prune. So I thought, wow, there's a lot of people who want to get involved. Why not ask them to get involved? And so some of my goals to cultivate horticulture expertise and to have a lot of hands-on learning about history and gardening and ecology and diversity at large, and to just really build out a group of people that wanted to help me with the task of gardening City Hall. I thought it was just such a great idea. And so that's exactly what we did. I got a bunch of volunteers together and we weeded, we cleaned up around the base of the Horace Greeley statue. We planted a lot of new plants. These are some button bushes that I put right in front of City Hall. Most everything that I focused on was native. More plantings. This is kind of adjacent to the big civic building right across from City Hall. And then one afternoon, you would just have a big protest sweep through again. And, in this case, it was delivery workers who were letting their voices out for some of the things that they needed attention on. And we might be in the corner of the park with our volunteers identifying some weeds that we had just picked. So there was just always so much going on in this park during the summer of 2020. Then in the fall, we had a Dia de los Muertos celebration. And truly every day it was something different. And it was so beautiful to like see the park come back to life a little bit after the early days of the pandemic and to be gardening on the side and helping people with whatever they needed to be doing and expressing in the park. I had recruited an intern, Raquel, from NYU that fall as well, and using my herbaria experience, taught her how to collect specimens and mount them and label them and identify. So that was a really fun way to not just like do garden work, but to also teach her my joy of herbaria as well. And then at the end of 2020, I decided to take a job with Smithsonian Gardens. And it still being pandemic time, the team didn't have me rushing out into the gardens per se. And so I got to spend some time learning our tree collection here on the Smithsonian Gardens grounds. in writing about our magnolias. I'm sure most people are familiar with the saucer magnolias at the Hopped Garden. They are sort of like the peak springtime activity to rival the cherry blossoms. And I developed a walking sort of virtual tour using story maps to give people access who might still be at home or who are far away from DC to see our amazing collection of magnolias over a wide range of diversity. This is the beautiful Michiko Range, a Magnolia Saboldii from Japan that's kind of off in the Hopped Garden. And also this Magnolia Butterflies, which is in the Ripley Garden. And so I was like learning how to build this up. I was also learning the campus, which I had just moved down to DC to start tending to. And I got in a conversation with Janet in the Ripley Garden. And at the time, this was called Yellow Bird. And I was like, Janet, I don't know. I've been doing some research and I think you might have mislabeled this tree. And it was a fun way to kind of test my botanical prowess. And Janet is a force to reckon with. And so I got our arborist on my side and we all triangulated and realized that it was actually butterflies. So I was shaking up some leaves as I entered the Smithsonian. But this initiative with the magnolias was also just to draw a lot of attention to the saucer magnolias, and we developed this hashtag Magnolia Madness, where we encouraged all of the other departments across the Smithsonian to draw from their collections in terms of what they have magnolia related. So here's a tweet from Natural History back in 2021 of the first collected specimen of saucer magnolias from 1885, it looks like. And they had another post of Alice, who I know is on this call, with Magnolia Ashii, I believe. It's just fun to see, like, in this new institution for myself, like how people were getting on to, the joy of the magnolias and celebrating the blooms of the saucers that year. And so a lot of my first year was really just observing how everyone else was gardening around me. There are such fantastic gardeners all across Smithsonian Gardens, and there was so much to learn. And I really didn't have a lot of experience with annual design. So I wrote a short blog about kind of how I had processed the different approaches to annuals. And seeing how everyone does it so differently. This is Janet's work in the Ripley Garden. This is Rick's work at the castle. You can just see the juxtaposition of groups of annuals and color blocks versus the crazy whimsy of these tropicals on the left. Looking at the pared down palette in the rose garden to not take too much away from the roses themselves, or the intense, precision of the Hopped Garden parterre and the thousands of lantanas that make up the design there. And then over to American history, where they've got the really magically pink crepe myrtles, and they try to like bubble that color underneath of it in a really fun way. Or over at African American history and culture, where they have tied in culturally significant plants like the okra to help tell a story in their cafe area. So I was really just breathing in a lot of these different approaches to how to use annual plants, whereas most of my focus was more in perennials and in native plants. And so kind of after that, I was given my assignment for my Smithsonian Gardens tenure over here at the Natural History Museum. You guys might have walked against this Triceratops getting in here tonight, but I was trying to play nice and feed it some Rudbeckia laciniata. And I got right to work. The landscape here, as you might know, is really focused on native plants. And I was really curious about how I could approach quote unquote native plant gardening through a new lens. And one way that I decided to do it was to just figure out what native plants we weren't growing. I took this section here on the left. This photo on the left is on the east side of the southern part of the landscape here. There's a stairwell kind of right below there to get down to the parking lot. And I just wasn't really happy with the Myrica cerifera that's on this left-hand corner. It was right on the edge, blocking the whole view of the rest of the garden behind it. Silphium perfoliatum, the cup plant, had self-sown really aggressively into this area which that plant is easily 10 feet tall in a good year. And there just wasn't much legibility. There was some chestnut trees, which are not American chestnut trees. That's a different story. Anyway, I was like, I think this is a great place to clear out and to start fresh. So that's exactly what I did. I got rid of everything that I didn't want there. I left a few bones and got to ordering plants. This is what plants kind of look like when you order them in bulk bags, and then you break them open and they're growing and you're really happy that they haven't all died in transport, and you lay them out and you plant them in the springtime, and all of a sudden I had a new matrix of plants. And just for reference, this was sort of the species list. I know for people inside that might be difficult to look at, but I'd be happy to share it afterwards. The main focus of this plant list was it was representing 30 taxa over 20 families, because I was really trying to just expand diversity. We are the Natural History Museum. We have botanists inside working on conservation and expanding diversity. We should be doing it outside as well. So this was kind of the goal of this garden bed. And have a very strong interest in herbaria, so I would sneak into the herbarium inside here all the time. Carl was my inside agent with Ken as well, but also Gary Krupnick, who gave me some permission to start exploring the Orchidaceae. And with the help of the digital resources from natural history, I was like, okay, there's a lot of orchids that used to live in DC. I'm curious about that. Here, zooming in on this label, we have Pogonia ophioglossoides over in the Kenilworth Swamp as of 1899. We've got this, which used to be called Orchis spectabilis, is now Gallieris. This was in Rock Creek in 1876. And then this really fascinating Isotria, Isotria affinis, which I think they have re-identified as Medialoides, which is a very rare orchid to the East Coast now. Found this specimen, which really spoke to me. This is a letter from Edgar Wary, and I wanted to point out a few lines in this letter. He said, he's talking about going out to natural areas, and he's like, that year I counted 75 plants of this Isotria species. The next year, 5 or 6, and although I returned at the right time for the next 10 years, not a single one ever showed up again, and now real estate has taken over. This really just kind of framed everything that I needed to start doing outside in the gardens, because here we were in what used to be swampland, and we have built gardens and we're trying to tell stories. The conservation of orchids seems like a really cool story to begin telling. And just to commemorate Edgar Wary, he was actually a mineralogist in the mineralogy department here at Natural History in like the 1920s, and then became a notable botanist in Pennsylvania. I think after that he was really into Sarracenias and ferns. But this just felt like a gem to find this letter and be really inspired by him. So yeah, I set my sights on native orchid conservation. There's a lot of orchids native to the DC area, to Maryland, to Virginia, that have been pushed out because of development, because we have bulldozed bogs. You name the sort of threat, it's happening. So I found a few specimens in DC of recent note, most importantly in Oxen Run Parkway, or I would say most explicitly in Oxen Run Parkway, which is over in Southeast. Peggy Fleming in 1989 found the Cypripedium macaulay. And then in the same site, she found this Listera australis in 1992. And I was like, wow, in Southeast, like that's crazy that not that long ago, some orchids were found. And just for some context, this is the site of Oxen Run Park, and it is right on the fall line, and it is actually a really specific magnolia bog ecosystem, which there's only like 12 magnolia bogs like in I think the world, and one is right here in Southeast, and it has an incredibly interesting ecology, and it is the native habitat of Magnolia virginiana. And I had never seen a magnolia bog, so I went and I looked for some orchids. This was in March. I think I was a little too early if there were going to be some orchids, but there was Cardamine concatenata, or toothwort, I think is the common name. And then I did find some Magnolia virginiana to kind of represent the magnolia bog that I was in. And there's a hospital up on the hill. You could easily go by this area in Southeast and not know that it's a globally rare ecosystem with some historic orchids that might still be living in there. But I was inspired by this and wanted to start growing orchids out in the landscape. So Carnivorous Plant Nursery, which is actually about 10 minutes from where I grew up in Western Maryland, they had a great list of orchids for sale. So our team went out and bought some in the winter. Here in the middle, we've got Spiranthes cernua, sort of bare root plants that we then potted up and put in the refrigeration room at the greenhouse over in Suitland. This is our team, Justin and Caroline at the time, potting up these plants. And part of this trial was to just see how we could make these orchids displayable because we wanted to learn how to grow them. Not a lot of people are growing native orchids, and just different ways that we can manipulate how visible they might be in the landscape. So we potted all the species up, like I said, put them in the refrigerator until about planting time, just to kind of simulate that winter. Since these are native to the DC area, we wanted to give them the same kind of treatment. And we experimented with taping those green pots that you see on the left. Those are the 5 Cypripedium macaulay specimens. Those were like the historic ones that were also found at Oxen Run. And you can tell that we taped the drainage holes on those 2 and they looked glorious. And then we used really open mesh pots on those other 3. And you can just visibly see which potting regimen these plants preferred. And we did the taping of the pots because most of these plants prefer to be in a bog situation. So we thought, conserving some water, not having just perfect drainage would aid these plants. For the Spiranthes, we did not use any of the mesh because they are definitely a bog-loving plant. And then it turned out that the matrix I had created on this corner was really the perfect site to experiment with these orchids because this edge that I had used, the Carex sprengellii, was really lush and kind of allowed the orchids to be hidden in plain sight. And you can see a need to hide very tender plants with just the level of engagement on the streets on any given day outside of the museum with tourists and visiting groups and people lunching. So it was a great sort of spot. And this was me planting a few of the last orchids for the day. I think those were some Spiranthes I had. And right in front of me is Styrax americanus, which is one of the woodies that I had put in this garden bed. Just some more examples on the left, Aplectrum hymal. Might be hard to see, but the soil knife in this picture here has like the stem of that inflorescence, which was over a foot long, and then it bent and stood up here. I had never seen like a 15-inch Aplectrum inflorescence before. I don't know what was happening to that plant. Very fascinating. Same thing with this Pogonia here. Very, very tiny orchid because it is like right there on the corner, but you can't, you can't see it even on my screen. And part of the trial was just seeing how these orchids fared in such a city-like landscape. Squirrels got after plenty of them. So these were just upturned pots, and sometimes the plants would be like dangling out of the lip of their pot and with roots chewed up and stuff. And I forgot to mention, part of the trial was we planted half of the specimens in their pots in the soil, and we planted the other half bare root, again, to just like test different ways of cultivating these orchids. We did have 2 Galliaris spectabilis species blooming in the first year as well. And then in the fall, when our orchids went dormant, I invited Melissa McCormick and Dennis Wiggum of the NAOC, North American Orchid Conservation Center down in Cirque, to come and sort of see the status of this trial. And we just took the pots out and started scraping through the soil to look for healthy tubers and buds for next year. And we found a lot of pots that had died, and they assured me that these are the normal mortality rates that most of these orchid trials have. So don't be too hard on yourself, but it was really great to have their support during this trial. And during this time, our Spiranthes was blooming against the Physocarpus in the landscape. It was just a really beautiful moment. And then just to zoom out, it was fall, and I felt really satisfied with the work that I had accomplished on this corner. And then kind of to bolster my orchid knowledge that I was doing ex situ, it was really important for me to get back out into wild places and do some botanizing. And so I went to the Upper Peninsula, Michigan, for the Native Orchid Conference in 2023. Got to see, I saw so many species that year, but my favorite was Platanthera cycoides of this sort of white pink variety. They're usually a little bit more purple. The next year we went to Eastern Texas, kind of the Nacogdoches area. Got to see some Calopogon tuberosus and the um, uh, longleaf pine kind of remnant forest, which is really threatened as well. Beautiful landscape. And connected with some researchers at West Virginia Wesleyan to go view a very rare population of Cleisteasiopsis bifaria, which is maybe the most beautiful, stunning alien-like orchid I have seen. Um, and if you have never gone botanizing, this is pretty much what it looks like. That's me looking at, I think Spiranthes lacera, if I can remember correctly. And so beyond orchids, I really started framing a lot of my work through collection-oriented diversification efforts. In the garden, again on the south side, we had a planting of Magnolia macrophylla, and then they were kind of bounded by these two Magnolia virginianas. And macrophylla is an amazing tree, and it was such a cool moment in the landscape. And I thought, well, why don't we just like build out a bigger library of magnolias here so that people can do some botanizing in a really small part of the garden, all encompassed, and you can learn some different varieties of native magnolias in one spot. So that's what I did. I got a hold of Magnolia ashii, which we saw earlier with that photo of Alice. And everyone was always like, "Wow, like these leaves are so big," and yes, they are. So I kind of ironically planted a banana underneath of it just to like trick people, and why not? It's fun. And some people think that ashii is like a variety of macrophylla, but I consider it a species. I don't know if people in the room have an opinion on that. I also put in Magnolia acuminata, kind of in this patch of jewelweed that I had established. And we also got, this is our arborist Jake at the time, helping me install Magnolia tripetala. And it actually bloomed in the first year. That one's kind of at the base of the garden. But I did just check on all of these trees before I came in. They're alive and well and looking happy. Um, and so beyond all of this more like collection driven, herbaria driven, conservation driven work, I was also busy maintaining the rest of the landscape, building beautiful displays all over. This was sort of a native Rosaceae garden on the western corner of the garden, where instead of just roses, I wanted native roses and other native rosaceous plants. So there's some spirea here, there's a wild cherry, there's some amelanchier here. I don't know if this garden is still holding on though. And some other vignettes to just like conglomerate a lot of similar species. It's just like some varieties of asters that I thought would be cool to have all together. This is like a contain. You can't even see the container, but that's a container in the landscape with Amorphophallus konjac, which is a perennial Amorphophallus. Got my hands on, I'm forgetting the name of this Callirrhoe, but I'm obsessed with it and had fun with that little spot. I'm curious if it's been self-sowing since I've left. Some fun honey garlics and violas, and just kind of having a lot of fun with unique combinations. There was this patch of Gervilla Cool Splash, which is the variegated, almost white and green plant in the foreground. And for the life of me, I couldn't figure out what to mix with this plant with. And then I was like, what about Rhododendron calendulaceum? And I think it's a cool combination. I like the colors, but you guys might think differently. And yeah, just vignettes left and right that I just kind of worked on and spruced up some old areas of the garden, planted thousands of daffodils. And excitedly got a hold of our Amorphophallus titanum in full leaf the summer of 2024 to kind of build out this vignette at the Triceratops and just really make it feel Jurassic. I don't know. I really loved putting this display together. And actually, in front of the sculpture is longleaf pines, which to mimic a fire coming through, I actually ripped off all of the juvenile needles on the stems because they were getting so shaggy that you couldn't see anything through the garden. So I was like, well, I can simulate a fire with my hands. Just some other vignettes and some mourning doves enjoying the seeds of Cynara or the like the ornamental artichoke. The Magnolia asheyi is right in the background there. And I did just want to like call out that, there were two other horticulturists, coworkers of mine, Sylvia and Mike, who managed other sides of the museum. And so they were always helpful in a lot of this work, including our volunteer efforts. Kainat, who's in the room, she was a big support and just the upkeep of this landscape. And it was a lot of fun to be a part of this team here. At the end of 2024, I decided to part ways. We're almost done. I know haven't checked the time. I'm sure we're over. Okay. It's what? 53 minutes. Oh, perfect. Wow. Couldn't have planned it better. I decided to transition away from Smithsonian Gardens at the end of 2024. I moved to Lake Tahoe because I've always really enjoyed skiing and wanted to be a ski instructor. If this presentation has taught me anything, is that I really like to move around. But yeah, I got to do some botanizing in the early season up on the mountains. This is oh gosh, California sagebrush. I'm forgetting the Latin on it. But it was early season, so the snows weren't that deep, and I got to see some things poking through the snow. Got to ride the lifts down this gorgeous view, learn a lot of evergreen species. Got to go to the Bay Area to see the Scoliopas in bloom down in John Muir Woods, which is like a January blooming species. Fun to do some winter botanizing. This is in Tilden Regional Botanic, kind of up in Berkeley foothills. This rare Erythronium, which I had only ever seen Erythronium americanum over in the East Coast. And then Carl actually came and visited me because he was going to help me drive back east to New York City again. I have sort of finished my career trajectory in 2025, learning what private gardening is like, because I've just always in horticulture been so interested in like the diversity of work to do. And I had never worked in private and got on an amazing team this summer. Two different teams, two great people that I've worked for, and just being in some beautiful terraces, backyards. This is a landscape. The buildings here were designed by I.M. Way, a famous architect, and there's this gorgeous courtyard garden for the residents here that we maintain. We've got some movie industry folks with some interesting props they wanted us to build a garden around. And some estates up in Riverdale. This is like really close to Wave Hill, if anyone's been to that public garden before. And some great views of the city when you're in Brooklyn Heights. Um, Great views of Central Park when you're on some really cool terraces. Um, and also just revisiting some gardens that I'd fallen in love with when I lived in the city back in 2019, 2020. This is Fort Tryon Park and their Heather Garden, which is also in that Inwood sort of northern Manhattan tip, which is absolute. You have to go in the spring. It is stunning. And so it's been fascinating to be back in New York and kind of moved away from my conservation work and learning how to deal with, not deal with, but to work with clients who are wanting specific things. And I think as I head back to New York in March to rejoin the cruise that I work on, it's sort of my challenge to push homeowners into more of a conservation minded, native plant minded garden structure. And that's harder than I thought it would be. But I only have one season under my belt within private gardening, but it's a goal of mine to build my own business over the next couple of years. So I'm just grateful for the foundation that I've had and all of these different experiences to step into building a business that I think is not just your average landscape company, and to frame what we need to be doing to be good stewards of our ecology, and so that we can hold on to all of these beautiful plants, whether they're endangered or not. I think every plant has a worthy place in the garden, even non-natives, maybe not the invasives, but just wanted to say thank you for your time. And it's meant a lot to me to come back to this museum where I've spent years gardening and to kind of digest the work that I've done and to talk to you about it. It means a lot to me. So thank you guys.
Do you want to do the chat questions first?
So I think open it up and maybe open it up to folks online first and
Sure.
Yeah, if you want to hop over to that chair. like
Okay.
in the chat. You want to do the in-person or the?
do online first.
Okay.
Yeah.
So let's see. How did you make this pop up earlier? Where is Zoom? No. How do we get to the Zoom chat, Abe?
Oh, yeah, there was,
Is it this?
we did this originally. I should have.
I see there's a bunch in the chat. Okay. So from Eric Evans, I love the Magnolia ashii punched up by the bananas. I generally think it cuts through the general ennui or ignorance of the public to introduce people to totally new plant contexts. Well, I'm going to look for some actual questions. That was a lovely comment though, Eric. Thank you. Let's see.
Nablus, yes, it's such a cool plant. I don't know who said that.
Is the Magnolia virtual tour still available? Do you know?
Yeah, it's still online. I can
Okay.
send a link.
Okay. Could you talk a bit about the challenges of native plant gardening in urban soils, pH, compaction, disturbance, etc.?
Yeah, that's a good question, especially as it related to our orchid trial. In all of the research that I did, there was an emphasis on irrigation water or city water here down on the mall, having inputs and like chlorine, for example. And a lot of these orchids are sensitive to anything but distilled water or natural rainfall. And so that was part of our trial. We didn't necessarily have a way at the time to like apply non-irrigated water to these crops. And the trial that I was responsible for, existed for 2 years. So the status of those orchids in the sort of irrigated water system, I can't really comment on, but we were very aware of that. And that was also why we planted some of the orchids in pots in the soil versus half bare rooted in the soil, because the mycorrhizal relationships with a lot of these orchids are very specific to the places you might find them in the wild. So again, being aware that like we don't necessarily have the soil inoculated, but how will they do without it?
Hmm. Did you take any that had soil with them? I mean, did you do transplants like that?
No, we didn't disturb any wild orchids. All of the specimens that we used for this trial were sold from the Carnivorous Plant Nursery in Western Maryland. So we just purchased all of those.
Okay, thanks. That's really exciting.
Thank
You've
you.
done an amazing amount of things. It was a great talk. Thank you.
I really appreciate that.
Do we want to do some in-person questions? I can start. What is your favorite winter blooming perennial? And if it's not witch hazel, why not?
I gotta say, I am so struck by hellebores to this day. When I was in City Hall and you saw that picture, that was January 2nd, and with the snow that the East Coast just got, there were no blooming hellebores this January. But it's really interesting to me to see a plant that has such a sensitivity to the uniqueness of each winter that we have, where like they might even be blooming as early as December, whereas like maybe normally they're early March, late February. But I just appreciate a plant that has such variability in its blooming capacity. And just as a plant in a garden, the hellebore's foliage is essential to just keep your ground covered. And it's a great plant to have things growing out of, tulips growing out of your hellebores. It's the best perennial.
Another one from online. Well, first of all, Ray Mims says, hello, Philip. And can you use rain barrels to collect rainwater for a small patch of the orchids?
Yes. You read our thinking, you read our mind on our thinking. If I had stayed around to work on this project longer, we were going to be installing some rain catchment systems just to like do some specific irrigating for the orchids. But even that wasn't a perfect idea because the irrigation system here at the museum is automated and is accounting for all of the other plants that aren't orchids as well. So we couldn't necessarily turn off the irrigation system and just water by hand with a barrel, for example. Just it was just too much of a thing to do. So yeah, it wasn't a perfect system. There were a lot of kind of catches there.
Cool. Anyone else? Oh, we'll go you first.
Remove
Yeah,
the hydrangeas, I think.
yeah, the oak leaf hydrangeas.
Is there anything gonna be going back in there?
It was
Did
a
you do a rock?
It was a poor photo, but there was a photo of sod that we had rolled off, and it
They
looked
just wanted sod.
yeah, it looked brown, and it was it was the day that we installed it. But yeah, just turf.
Did the problems they were having, like, did they improve after? Were the hydrangeas actually contributing to these problems they were having, or?
Yeah, that was sort of the frustration, right? Is that like we got the directive from the NYPD, if I'm being honest, and they were like, we need the gardeners to do this. This is the solution. And it was just sort of like a pointing fingers operation of like, who can we send to visually say that we've done something? Which I think in so much of like civic work is unfortunately what happens. People just want to have someone to blame and someone to like do the work on their behalf, not really thinking about long-term solutions. I did visit Harlem Art Park a few months after that. There was like a community art day, and because I just wanted to see who was in the community and like who had things to say about the space, and it was nice to talk to people that day. And hear people's frustrations, and some people were actually happy. They were like, it had sort of diminished some of the problems, but if I'm being honest, it just moved the problem to a different part of the park. The protection of the bushes gave people privacy, if anything. It just kind of forced people to be more out in the open. So it's not like a perfect solution. Missy.
So with your future lucrative private clients next to you, what are some like and they're not quite on the native trade, like what are some native heavy hitters or gateway natives or native combinations that you think that will really like kind of change that conversation that you're hoping to pursue?
That is a good question because a lot of private clients want immediate results. They want immediate, like, beautiful things. So I try to pitch ideas seasonally to people, like, and really like having a conversation with people that your garden is going to look different throughout the year. I think it seems basic maybe to us, but to really emphasize that like a plant in this part of the garden will be doing its thing in April, and then on the other side of the garden in the summer and the fall. And so when that like knowledge is improved upon, it doesn't always even matter like what the plants are. It's just convincing people to trust the whole year. Because I could give you a million answers to that, but I think that has worked the most for me, is just like being as transparent as possible about the parts of the garden that are going to have their moments, instead of like, my garden is amazingly beautiful 100% of the time. It's like setting realistic expectations.
Okay, we have a couple more online questions. How far out are you thinking when planting gardens in public spaces?
Well, I think, with the matrix that I had first installed with the sedges, I wasn't thinking about orchids when I was installing that. I was really just focusing on diversification at a baseline. So yeah, I'm not much of a planner, honestly. Like, ideas kind of come to me, and then I see opportunities to take advantage of the opportunities, and so that's kind of my style. But yeah, I kind of just like it's important to read the landscapes that you work in, and a lot of times you might have a grand idea for something that just doesn't fit within the space. So yeah, reading the landscape and responding to its opportunities is really essential.
Maybe we'll do another in-person one.
Sure.
Was that Ian? Yep.
So it was nice to see that you went and did some lichen field work with James. Did that give you any inspiration on ways to, obviously lichens are pretty difficult to cultivate, but ways to highlight naturally occurring non-vascular plants and fungi within your gardens? Have you thought about that?
And I'm just going to repeat it because they're saying they can't hear. So Ian is asking about if you had gotten any inspiration about incorporating non-vascular plants and lichens in the landscape. Is that okay?
To be honest, no. I was like, that was cool. Actually, but what I did take away most from that experience was we were collecting lichens and we were also doing forest health assessments to kind of like relate in the research, okay, X species of orchid or lichens were here. What was the health around where they were found? And that sort of framed, there was usually more diversity of lichens in a healthier forest. And so we would identify all the trees in the area, and that gave me sort of like, okay, in research it's really important to not just be focused on the one thing you're looking at, but like the whole system. That was honestly my biggest takeaway from that experience.
One more online one. Can you speak about any fantasies you have about the perfect blend of ecological horticulture and human-centered cosmopolitan sophistication? I want beauty and a healthy world. And that was from Eric Evans. It was a very Eric Evans question.
Wow. Eric, I think we might have to get together tomorrow and talk about that, which we have scheduled. So,
Any other in person? Natalie?
First time I want to say I really loved the dinosaur area looking. Yeah, that was cool. I like that a lot.
Thank you.
But I want to. So this is like a smaller part of the presentation, but I don't know much about plants personally. But the story maps that you made, I was curious first, what tool did you use, and B, was like the audience meant for people who weren't going to see those plants in person, or is it more meant for like people walking it and like find out more about it as they were going through the story maps?
So
I want to know more about that tool.
Yeah.
Just to repeat the question for those online. So Natalie was asking, how did you make the story maps, and about the audience of the story maps, and were they for people coming to see the plants in person or online?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, so story maps is a feature of ArcGIS. Like if you Google ArcGIS story maps, I think it was free a few years ago. Anyone can create a story map, and you basically just like like in this case, we had ArcGIS pinpoints of our tree collection, so I could use those data points and know that, okay, the Magnolia suboldii is there, and then I can like attach a photo of it, and then you manually walk through it. Like you can pick as many data points as you want to tell your story essentially. But I did build that for people who would maybe never even visit the campus, because we have really cool magnolias. And otherwise, like, and at the end of that map, I led you to where you could go to our plant explorer, because like maybe you are on the landscape and you see a label for a tree, a magnolia that wasn't in the story map. Like there's a feature at Smithsonian Gardens to go and like type in what you read on a label, and it will populate information about it online. Not kind of like a QR code, you'd have to manually enter that name, but there's resources for sure. So I was just trying to like highlight those resources as much as I could.
So I think we have time for one more question if we have one. Okay, I don't think that's a question, but it's a nice comment. Okay, we have one more question from Ivana, and this will be our last question. What lessons have you learned about bringing a participative element / mentorship into your work in public-facing gardens, especially thinking about the City Hall Park Alliance?
That's a really good question. I feel like like, for example, when I got to City Hall, it was my first gardening position really outside of that mobile crew that I mentioned. And I had a degree in horticulture, but that didn't mean I had like learned how to be a gardener. They're two very different things. And so I was really teaching myself in the field how to be a good gardener, and it just felt kind of natural to bring people along with me on that journey. There was a lot of I think there's a lot of interest across the across the spectrum of people who want to learn more about gardening and want to be more participative in the landscapes around them. And so a lot of times it's just giving people an in and saying, yes, come join me. Yes, like help me out, or even just like spending time in gardens. It's not always about like the work. It's just like enjoying together. And so I feel like to not have a participative, excuse me with that word, like experience, I just feel like other people are missing out on and how exciting it is to be in this field.
Okay. Do you want to?
I'll just sort of speak to that just from working with Phil, that I just really feel like working with you, like it really enriched my life and like completely changed my relationship with the city, because like now I can see it through like plants and curiosity. Like I don't know the names of all these plants, but I can be like curious about them. I can be curious about my landscape, and yeah, it like gives me a completely different relationship with the city than when I first moved here. So
That's so sweet. Thank you.
Okay. Do you want to do closing remarks, Lee, or?
Sure. Thank you. Yeah, huge, huge thank you. Thank you so much for joining us, especially in person. Great turnout tonight. Everybody online, lots of accolades coming online. Yeah, stay tuned. As you'll see from our calendar next month, we've got a lot of fun stuff. We're in the field. You'll see announcements on a date specific for going. It's hard to believe that in this freeze, in this whatever they're calling this ice thing, that that we will have plants emerging, but we really will very quickly. So next month, March, spring is coming. The tufted titmouse is definitely singing a tune that spring is coming. And thank you, everybody. Great participation. Stay tuned for your mugs and your stickers. And invite your friends. This is a great thing. So spread the word. We have a great year in front of us. And again, thank you so much for being with us.
My pleasure.
Yeah.
Wait.
There we go.
Wait, just-